All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Healing in the Classroom Trauma-Informed Approaches for Back to School Success. Our goal for the webinar today is to offer understanding of trauma-informed practices, their impact, and the influence of work culture in an educational setting. We will explore how these factors affect our students, families, and generational learning, as well as provide strategies and solutions to start the school year off effectively. My name is Jendina Bowers. I am the founder and chief social impact partner at Sky Infinity, where we help organizations and public service provide them with solutions to retain workforce and flourish communities. I am partnered today with Laura Merchant, who is an early childhood specialist educator who was drawn to learning about trauma from and seeing the adversities for her preschoolers we're contending with. She completed her master's in education with a certification in trauma-informed practices and resiliency in order to best support her students. Trauma-informed practices within schools has become her passion. When we come to these spaces, we come here in the assumption or with the need to grow. So I have a few growth maintenances to help us maintain that growth as we move throughout the training and webinar today. First, I'm going to ask to release ego, pride, arrogance, and judgment. We all have it, and we all struggle with it and deal with it. So release those and embrace vulnerability, grace, humility, and justice. And we all deserve those. Avoid harmful words, tones, and gestures. Overly communicate interpretations and perspectives. Collaborate and express appreciation. And do not overthink. Have fun. You will see that we will be doing Q&A. We can do Q&A throughout the meeting. There is a triangle, square, circle box in the lower right-hand corner of the meeting. And if you click on that and you scroll to Q&A, that will be a place where you can hit the plus button and submit a question. And we will get to your questions at the end of the training. So we want to start off with communing. That's what we do. We want to connect and we want to hear from you all. So our first thing to kick us off is, what's your back to school memory? This could be something that you may feel like was fantastic or great, or it may not be so great. That's all okay, but it's still a back to school memory and we want to hear from you all.
I'll share a memory.
Yes, thanks, Amber.
So I have a memory of the first day of school having to go around and telling a fun fact about yourself or reintroducing yourself to people that you went to school with before and having to try to come up with something that you thought was cool enough to say in front of the other kids in a class. So yeah. I remember the first day of school feeling a little bit cringy because you had to, you wanted your outfit to look cool. You wanted that part. You didn't want to say something that was corny or, get made fun of, and racking your brain to think of introducing yourself in front of the class is something that I always remember every year.
Right. Thank you for sharing, Amber. That resonates with me. I think mine was kind of more of a horror memory, but it was a memory and it's something that I've learned from nonetheless, and it's helped me where I am today. Going back to school, I was always like, Mom, why haven't we gotten new shoes yet? Like, where's our new shoes? People are going to talk about me. Where's my new shoes at? Or, nowadays my kids are like, well, when we go back to school, they want to know what you did over the summer. And all of my friends have they traveled out the country or they went on a vacation and we didn't get to do that, or, all those things. So yeah.
Yeah, so there can be a little bit of anxiety, right, around that. Like, oh my gosh, what are other people going to think? And I think for me, that I don't remember the actual being in school. I just remember the night before and being so excited to go, but also really nervous and not being able to sleep well that night. Year after year, that happened.
Right. Right. Yeah. The nerves, and when something big is coming, you get no sleep.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Laura, I'm going to transition this over to you, and so you can help us with understanding what trauma is.
Sure. And actually, as an adult, I still get those jitters going back to school as a teacher. So it's not just unique to students. But as we do enter the school year, we do need to be thinking about trauma. And just if there are people listening who don't really know about it, it has sort of turned into a buzzword. However, it's real, and it's something we really need to address. So trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that overwhelms the nervous system, and that leaves a person feeling helpless or unable to cope. So you'll see misbehaviors and quotes on this slide, and that's because every behavior has a purpose and and a reason behind it. And what we're really talking about today is how we're shifting the way that we look at students, and we're shifting the way that we look at their behaviors and how we respond to those. So trauma-informed, So what are ACEs? So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And the ACE study was conducted over a course of 2 years from 1995 to 1997. And it was conducted by Dr. Anda from the CDC and Dr. Folletti from Kaiser Permanente. And over 17,000 Kaiser members took part in this study. And its purpose was to determine if adverse childhood experiences in the first 18 years of life impact the health and well-being of adults later on in life. So if we talk about what ACEs are, according to the study, first of all, they're common in all populations, and they are the source of trauma. So according to the study, the ACEs were categorized into 3 groups, and those were abuse, which is emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse. Household challenges, that would have been where the mother was treated violently, substance abuse or mental illness in the home, suicide attempt, parental separation or divorce, and or an incarcerated household member. Emotional neglect would be where the child is not feeling loved, they're not feeling attended to, the family was not a source of strength or support for them. And physical neglect is a lack of food, lack of medical care, and maybe caregivers were too intoxicated to care for the child. So there are other sources of trauma, which we know we've been living through natural disasters. We've been living through a pandemic, COVID. So disease, car accidents, famine, war, systemic racism, kids in the foster care system. So again, any event that overwhelms the nervous system, leaving a person, adult, child, feeling helpless and with the inability to cope. And toxic stress is when a person is living chronically in the stressful situation. So a child living at home with abuse that happens daily, that causes a prolonged stress response, which is the fight, flight, or freeze. And that is incredibly unhealthy to stay in that state. The findings of the ACE study were almost 2/3 of study participants reported at least having one ACE. More than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs. And what they realized was that as the number of ACEs increased, so did the risk for negative health outcomes. So trauma literally lives in the body, and it can be generational and it can be intergenerational. So it doesn't cause a genetic mutation or change DNA, but it does leave a chemical mark, or can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, and that can be passed down to future generations. So it alters, it alters the way genes are expressed, or how they're turned on or how they're turned off. And all of that is called epigenetics, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. So when we think about some of the factors that contribute to these misbehaviors, and then we also can look at how that impacts possibly the path of a child's life. Some of those factors are poverty, lack of health care, lack of early childhood education, abuse, neglect, harsh discipline policies at school, such as zero tolerance. That can lead to suspensions and expulsions, racial disparities, lack of resources within schools, overcrowded classrooms, unqualified teachers, which we're getting a lot of now because of our short staffing across the country. You kind of just have to pull in people as you can. Implicit bias, insufficient funding. That's another thing we're facing with budget cuts all over the place. There might be insufficient funding for school counselors, for special educators, for learning materials. Police and school resource officers often have little or no training to actually work with youth and to work in the schools. And then that ends up with lots of arrests for minor infractions. And that's mostly targeted to students with disability and students of color, which then can lead to the juvenile justice system and juvenile detention facilities, hence the school to prison pipeline, which we'll also touch on a little bit later. So trauma-informed practices do not diagnose, they don't treat the impacts of trauma, and it's not a curriculum. It's a mindset and an understanding of where students are at and how they're presenting to us. And trauma-informed care shifts the mindset of thinking, what is wrong with a student? And instead thinking, well, what happened to this student? Let's look a little deeper. Maybe there are reasons for this behavior. It fosters a culture and climate that's physically, emotionally, and relationally safe, not just for students, but educators and families. It acknowledges power imbalances, prioritizes healthy and positive connections. It ensures that all school staff understand the impacts of trauma and that they respond to behaviors, harm, and safety concerns consistently and through empathy and accountability to restore balance. It's collaborating with outside agencies to help address basic needs. So instead of blaming families for shortcomings, it's partnering with them to help and support them. So then what do trauma-informed practices actually look like within a school? So it's about building relationships with students and connecting with them before correcting their behavior. And you can do this by using body-based language. So you might be observing how they're presenting and say something like, something seems off today, or your body's looking really tight. And then just pause and see what they say and how that proceeds. Co-regulation, this is when adults help the student regulate when they're dysregulated. So they might talk them through a grounding exercise. They might initiate some breath work. And then you teach self-regulation skills when students are regulated. Because if they're dysregulated, they're not in a place for learning. Their prefrontal cortex is offline. They can't process anything at that point. So when they're regulated, you want to teach like deep breathing skills, that they can take a break. They can participate in some intense exercise or some movement or some pressure, use pressure points. They can draw, they can write, give them some things, some coping strategies. It also teaches healthy communication skills such as respect and consent, teaching them to use names when they address people instead of being like, hey you. And active listening, how to really be part of a conversation. It's about repairing harm and accountability. So circling up is a tool that teaches social skills and problem-solving skills in a safe place where students and teachers openly connect with each other. So when harm has occurred, you can circle up and everybody involved has a chance to say how the harm impacted them. And can whoever join, oh, thank you for muting. So they all have a chance to say how the harm impacted them, and they all have a say as to what the repair will look like. And repair is a huge part of this. Many schools are implementing restorative practices and as a trauma-informed framework. And just to give credit where it's due, restorative practices has deep roots with Indigenous communities throughout the world. And circles are typically a part of restorative practices. So why trauma-informed practices work? Well, they foster resilience and hope. They build relationships. They create community that values voice and agency, especially for marginalized groups. They help schools to become better equipped to address the impact of trauma and adversity and increase resilience and healing. It helps to prevent violence and works against institutional violence in our school systems. And through this process, teachers will be learning about their own ACEs and their own trauma and their own implicit bias. And we will come to an understanding that we all carry the impacts of trauma with us daily. And this is the informed trauma informed practices also make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, and we're not inadvertently re-traumatizing each other or students. It's to make a safe space for students and for all school staff so teachers can finally teach and students can finally learn. It puts structures in place for the success of each individual student, socially, emotionally, and academically. So we teachers have the ability to influence student behavior, and we have the power to change the trajectory of a child's path in life. So it's really important that we have trauma-informed schools, that we do this work. It can also help aid in stopping generational trauma, which for me is the end goal. So go ahead. Jendina, you're muted. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for that. So thank you, Laura. And you're right. We want to stop generational trauma, and to do so, we need to change our mindset, listen to trust, and to believe our young people. I love what you were talking about when you're talking about misbehaviors. So I just wanted to add that when students show signs of irritability and anxiety, which culturally shows up in diverse ways among the individuals, to an untrained educator, this could easily fall into the stereotypes and implicit bias and things that are that we get from things that are flooding in our media outlets. I also want to throw out there is that we have to change our mindset about what education is in the community and how education and community is. I know you mentioned something about collaborating with others to help, not blame. We must avoid saying that it's the parents' responsibility, it's the taxpayers' fault, it's the neighborhood to blame, or all of that. When we are part of that community, public policy, public education, educators, we're all part of this village, and whether we like it or not, that is part of us. And we cannot just come in and get a paycheck and then go back to our comfy homes and say, hey, let the community deal with it. That's community robbery. So we must stay in the village. So how can I help when I'm so burnt out? Burnout is extremely delicate because oftentimes we get so consumed in the thing that we don't pay attention to how it's impacting us or others around us. Most people believe that it comes strictly from your job or your line of work, but it actually comes from the environment in which you are in. And whenever you're experiencing too much emotional, physical, and mental fatigue for a long period of time, that is when onset begins. And if it's not caught and addressed effectively, this can lead to chronic mental and physical health illnesses. So one of 4 types of burnout is the frenetic burnout. Frenetic burnout is the overwork aspect of burnout. So you'll go from overwork to under challenge to then neglecting and habitual burnout. So overload is actually what it sounds like. Overload is working hard, high pursuit, demand after demand with little to no rest. And the education system is full of requirements, demands, timelines, standards, and unhelpful status quos, which leads to our society bleeding from the inside out. Matter of fact, it was school where I learned that I would be competent to work in a certain job or go to a certain school based off of my standardized scores, work ethic, interpersonal skills, or presence that were all based off of a standardized expectation. And what you see here, educators and administrators alike are going to suffer from the standard of work culture in the education system. This model demonstrates variables that staff and educators experience on an ongoing basis in their line of work. And this is also categorized by the organizational and the personality factors. So as you can see, these factors here then trickle into the feelings of pressure, and then the experience and environment, and your sensation or perception of self-esteem, and then comes into the stages of burnout. We touched a little bit on the standards and status quos of the education system, so we'll segue into the role and work demands. Role and work demands are huge indicators for the quality of service you're gonna get when you're, or whether or not you'll experience burnout and how soon, and the intent to leave or exit an organization. Educators oftentimes are working under unrealistic constraints, which does not serve the students, teachers, nor our system well. When managing a huge responsibility with educating our society, this is nothing that should go itemized or taken lightly, because the results do impact everyone. So it deserves the proper time, diligence, and work for a healthy societal and economic future. And I want to know, by a show of ones in the chat, how many of you guys, how many have been in or know of school structures that may be hazardous? I know I have. Some places still have issues. They're still struggling with lead, water, mold, pests, and insufficient utilities. And most struggle, even if you have those addressed, most still struggle with the structural classroom and class sizes. Overpopulated classrooms are, there are evidence that overpopulated classrooms are organizational factors in a school environment that contribute to the increased feelings of burnout, stressed out, and overstressed staff and students, which does not make it conducive for learning or teaching. In the midst of absence, due to stress-related issues or feelings of overwork, there are going to be some fill-ins that lack the support and skills that students and teachers need to be successful in the classroom. Providing ample time for training, preparation, relationship building, and application can address many of these micro issues that have now turned into macro issues in our system. And hence, with the oversight of healing in the classroom and focusing more on the standard work culture, there are issues that continue to roll into this snowball of depersonalization and negatively impact our students and our families. Depersonalization is a loss of identity and purpose, and you start to feel like you're the only one that's committed to the responsibilities. Your efforts feel meaningless, you feel underappreciated, and feelings of resentment and neglect start to pour out. Depersonalization looks like absenteeism, which is frequently calling off, or stress-related FMLAs, or presenteeism, where you show up and, excuse me, and you go through the motions, but it's as an act of survival and self-preservation. Research has shown that turnover within 2 years of being hired which rings true for many areas of employment, especially those with poor work culture, impact the site. But this impact of turnover, the cycle of turnover, impacts us in education, our workforce, our economy, and it is detrimental to our growth as a country. Out of those turnover and exiting, the roles of people of color are 13% higher than those of non-color, and those of color only make up 3% of the workforce. Data also shows in education, teachers of color exit or turnover 22% higher than their counterparts of non-color. So what does this do for generational poverty? We want to know what you think. You can put your responses in the chat. How do you think ACEs impacts the representation of educators in the profession.
And Jendina, while people are doing that, I just wanted to add, as you were speaking, so much of what you said resonates with me as an educator. And, we're seeing more and more students come in with needs and more students with intensive needs coming into school without the capacity to serve them. And then with short staffing and turnover, people leaving just because for some reason, ever since COVID, things have just been really challenging.
Yes.
Burnout is real. It's real. People are overworked. Caseloads are too high. And yes, people are leaving and we really need that representation for students too. So that's really important.
You're so right, Laura. The pandemic has made a huge impact on our school system and I think our society as a whole, where we're not taking education as seriously anymore. But like to your point is, teachers are dealing with the impact that students had and they're behind in grade level, which means we're behind in curriculum, which means we're trying to we're pressured to get to these test scores, right? And at home, then it's, I guess I'm so stressed out, or I don't even want to do the work, or whatever it may be. School's not being taken seriously, and the influences of influencers are, is our main priority.
Right. Right. And unfortunately, we had this opportunity during COVID to really change things up and change, think outside the box, do things differently to serve kids the way we really need to and the way that they need to be served. And we just fell back into the status quo. It's really unfortunate.
I agree, but we still have the opportunity, right? There's no time, but there's no specific time to do the right thing. You know what I mean? Like you can do it now. So moving now, but that was definitely an opportunity to reshape and switch gears to make it a more healthy and equitable space.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's always time for change. So I just wanted to read this narrative. We have a slide on it, but I'll read it because it's pretty lengthy. It's a narrative we have from an anonymous student in response to their misbehavior in school. From pre-K through second grade, I was very hyper in the classroom. Starting in preschool, my teacher reprimanded me for pouring milk over my classmates' pizza. I forgot why I decided to do it, but I did. The teacher told my mother, who told my stepfather. As I was bathing that night, my stepdad stormed into the bathroom and beat me severely. I did not even know why I was being beaten until after it was over. This was the beginning of a long and contentious scholastic disciplinary history. That incident was my entry point into the pipeline. Eventually, the school was inspired to refer me to a psychiatrist who prescribed me Ritalin to calm me down. I felt like something was wrong with me. Why else did they say I needed pills? Why did teachers persistently call my mother and tell her that I was too disruptive? No longer did I see school as a welcoming experience for educational development. It simply became a place where, for whatever reason, I was required to be. So I just want to say a couple of things about that. One is that, as teachers, I think we have to really know our children and know their backgrounds and where they're coming from. And as much as I believe transparency is so important and that we inform parents and caregivers of what's happening with their children and students in school, there are some times when maybe these sorts of stories don't need to be shared, because really pouring milk on a piece of pizza, do you really need to inform a parent about that? These are little things that happen every day, all the time. So it's not really of any significance. And if you know that there's a history of abuse in the home, sometimes it's better not to share these minor things, because if it's going to create harm for the child at home, sometimes those things are best to just not share. The other thing I wanted to say is how incredibly sad that this story is, that this started in preschool, right? And it started over milk on pizza. It just goes to show how these little things that we do when we're not trauma informed and we don't know how to respond in appropriate ways, how they can have this ripple effect.
Thanks so much, Laura. When I was young, I've done things where I'm like, oh, let's see what happens if I do this. And it probably was not the kindest thing or just made sense at all. Like, why would you do that? We're just trying things out. But there, and then you get that response, and then you'll also feel. I also think that you feel targeted after you do one thing. Then they're like, "Oh, you're now labeled as a misbehaving child,"
Which
When
does
the-
happen. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, this is just your child development. This is,
Right.
how you learn. So which moves us into this: when we're born with some predisposed gifts and talents, right? And we're going to try those things. And I like to call these things our genetics. And our environments work like a thermostat with suppressing and expressing those genetics and genotypes. So healing environments from an adverse childhood experience or any adverse experience can potentially delay an early onset of any genes that may have an impression of trauma. So when we apply our understanding of life stages and development, I know that some of us may understand, but when we apply our understanding of life stages and development a lot more into the healing of the classroom, for example, kindergartners, we understand and that they're exploring that they need help. There are certain tasks where they can't do. We do understand and we apply that understanding and we help them. However, adolescent children or emerging young adulthood children aren't always given that service. At this stage of youth, all backgrounds experience what I like to call the developmental hump, which is the experience of another critical stage of development. Do we have any teenagers or their parents or their educators in the room today? If so, feel free to put a 1 in the chat. And I want to give you a huge shout out for the work that you're doing and for being here right now. You are preparing our leaders, our future leaders today for the success tomorrow. So just as critical as 0 to 5 or 5 to 9 ages of development, learning to walk, talk, play, adolescents are also in a critical stage of development too, where they are not learning just those fine motor skills, but they're trying to make sense of their world, and they're making new connections with their neurons in their brains, trying to figure things out, which no one has it all figured out. But unfortunately, the reality is the spaces and opportunity in education do not always allow grace for figuring things out like they need. So like any grown-up, unless you have like an invisible mojo of serenity, which I need, when you're stressed out, you lash out. Lashing out and enforcement of stricter rules is a common effect of burnout in education. When an educator is lacking sufficient rest and continues to be overstimulated throughout the day, they're less likely to apply restorative practices or recognize their own ACEs. And if any behavior in the classroom is causing disruption to their teaching or perceived as a disruption to learning for other students, an educator is more likely to enforce a zero tolerance policy versus putting a space together to understand where this behavior is coming from. And like many handbooks that I've read, it iterates that there's a threshold of certain disciplinary reports or calls or whatever may happen before the discipline starts to get a little bit more exclusionary. For example, after 3 or 4 reports, you're out of school, you can get out of school suspension or expulsion, whichever the school or handbook goes by. And many school systems do not have a plan B for the students that they have removed from the classroom, which this leads to a loss of literacy, increases dropouts, and increased generational trauma like juvenile justice involvement. And research has also shown that this affects for suspension of the student who gets suspended. This is to preserve the classroom or the learning atmosphere. There's little to no evidence that shows that this actually increases the learning atmosphere for those who are not suspended. What it looks like is causing more harm than good, and it's disproportionately impacting students of color than those of not color.
Jandina, can I just jump in for a moment?
Sure. Uh-huh.
So I just had some thoughts about some things you were saying about trauma delaying growth, and that is real. And I also have an example of that. But you know, the research is showing that the stage in development where the trauma occurs is the stage of development that gets stunted, right? It doesn't usually go beyond that after that. So you might
Yes.
see adults functioning as like an adolescent. Well, they probably had some trauma during that time in their lives. I also had a 5-year-old preschooler who would resort to literally going into a fetal position. And he had a lot of trauma in his life starting from being in the womb. So
Mhm.
so I just wanted to comment on that. Also about having the space to figure things out in school, with academic push down, that all of this pressure that educators have, even in the younger grades, what we're seeing is like academic push down is taking away their play. But their play is so important in those young ages because they're learning so many things, right? They're learning fine motor skills, spatial skills, communication skills, interpersonal skills, how to communicate with each other. So
Yes.
that's so
Mhm.
critical. And then back to what you were just talking about, I just wanted to add a couple of things. So students who are suspended for at least 10 days are less likely to graduate, and they're more likely to be arrested and incarcerated by their mid-20s. Students of color, like you had said, are far more likely than their white peers to be suspended, expelled, or arrested for the same kind of conduct, which are often minor infractions. And those with disabilities are particularly likely to travel down the school to prison pipeline. And then
Mm.
when students are out of school due to being in the juvenile justice system, re-entry into school is difficult, and the vast majority of them won't graduate from high school.
Thank you, Laura. That just helps us segue right into what you were just saying, re-entry into the classroom, and that road to graduation. So the topic of school resource officers has been pretty heavy in some school systems, and to address whether or not this solves the problem that we're faced with. From a trauma-informed standpoint, it's not the resource. This is not the resource we truly need, and it has the potential to create even more trauma or re-traumatize students. Students who are suspended or in re-entering into the classroom, they now have an additional ACEs and are expected to keep up with the classroom curriculum. And this is not fact, but I also believe that when you have that first offense, you're a target now and you have less grace to be on, and it creates a very super uncomfortable atmosphere where now you have to, if I show any signs of frustration or distress, I can't express it. And it also impacts my way of learning. So I have no regulation, but I have to learn and I have to catch up. Just think about how incredibly hard that is. And nonetheless, the data also shows that there are effects that more likely this impacts students of color than students who are not of non-color, widening and leading to more of the racial disparities in graduation. The school to prison pipeline is a well-known result of our systemic institutions. In fact, that there are elected politicians that admit to basing their number of prisons to be built off of the number of students who do not pass the standardized third grade reading tests. The pipeline begins when schools demonstrate harsh punishment for child stage behaviors, removing students out of schools, contributes to their illiteracy, their lack of independent thinking, and potentially results in other things that they do that may not be wise and result in juvenile justice involvement. Once they're involved in juvenile court, this will follow them throughout their adulthood and could sow new seeds of generational trauma. And you can see here that there are headlines that they are coincidentally showing up in the news where we are losing money in our education systems, but gaining money to build prisons throughout the United States. We are continuously experiencing stripping of resources, layoffs, and retracting resources in education systems where they're promised one thing, don't get it, or there's ongoing disrespect, there's ongoing trauma being produced in education systems. And then you also see on simultaneously, prisons are millions and billions of dollars are being poured into prisons throughout the United States.
Yeah, and with money being taken away from schools, I mean, research has long shown that reduced classroom sizes, restorative practices, engaging in culturally relevant curriculum, which we see is being taken away across the country, mental health supports, all of those things create safe, healthy, and joyful learning environments. So we really need to invest into our schools.
Yes, yes. I think we saw in our research, we saw a quote, and I can't remember who it was from, but it's invest in our futures and not in our prisons.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell us what you think. What policies or practices that you know of make it easier to punish than to heal in the classroom? And feel free to add those into the chat. And for time's sake, we're going to go through, and Amber, if there's anything that pops out to you, just let me know. But we're going to continue through. So put education first. Research tells us, and some of us may know from experience, that the lack of education can contribute to other outcomes in adulthood, such as poverty. Individuals who do not have a high school diploma or a general education development diploma or GED are likely working one of the many jobs in our country that do not avoid poverty or provide enough pay for their families to have a livable wage. So some work these and live in those circumstances. Others may take the matters into their own hands and work jobs and do work that may be illegal, and just to make a livable wage for their family. Again, spiraling into the prison system. So we're just about ready to give you all your strategies. But before we do that, we would like for you to please take out your phones, scan this QR code, or visit the website and use this code here to take a brief survey and let us know how we're doing. Laura, while everyone's doing that, is there anything that you wanted to add or about the prison system, or Amber, was there anything that you wanted to add? What's going on?
So to go back to, I think it was the second question that was asked, was how do ACEs affect the representation of educators in the profession? I can see it negatively impacting the representation, because if the studies and statistics show that students of color get reprimanded more and get harsher punishments and suspended and everything, why would those students want to then insert themselves into the education system as teachers if they feel like it was a waste of time for them, it was just something that they had to go through the motions to get through, or they were removed from the schools? Why would they then in turn become a part of that system?
That's a really good point. Good insight. I think what I was getting to with that question, or what interested me in asking, was same thing as kind of like, if I had these ACEs growing up in my environment, growing up, makes me have that environment where I'm struggling and it's not conducive for me to learn or to thrive. I'm carrying, even if I do want to go back as an educator, I'm carrying that experience with me in the role. And then statistics also show that the incidences that are happening disproportionately to children of color or students of color, it shows also in the educators who are leaving. educators of color are leaving 22% higher than their counterparts of non-color. So it's showing that we continue to have that environment that is not healing and does not suppress our feelings of trauma, our trauma impressions that are in our genetics, and it continues to kind of just, express or exacerbate the trauma that we feel, and so we leave.
I think also, ACEs aside, so many teachers, humans, right? This is a very human thing, come in with their own implicit biases. And I think if you don't even know how to look at yourself and see what those things are, it's going to come out in your teaching. It's going to come out in how you respond to certain students. So, part of the trauma-informed practices are looking at your implicit bias, looking at yourself. What did your upbringing teach you? What did your family and your surroundings and your schools and your teachers teach you? And once you can look at yourself like that, then you can really start to change how you're responding to all students and people in general.
Absolutely. One other thing I just want to tack on before we talk about the policies or practices that make it easier to punish. We also when you talk about implicit bias, right? That is from our lived experience. It's in things that we either have in our environment, what we're taught, what we're seeing, what's in our algorithm on social media, whatever it may be. So we're in our own little bubble with that implicit bias, and if we don't make ourselves uncomfortable to experience something different, we'll just always lean into that shortcut. And when we're in the hiring process, right? If teachers or educators of color are leaving within 2 years, those who are in the hiring role are more likely going to be represented by people of non-color. And with that implicit bias, it also challenges how I'm hiring, who I'm recruiting. And if I'm understanding, their language, because language is also in the interviewing process is also very difficult or delicate to navigate sometimes. But if we're in this process and I'm just looking for somebody who's looks like me, sounds like me, that I'm comfortable with, that I'm familiar with, that also, diminishes the representation too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even looking at how we write these job descriptions and how we put ads out there, right? We want to make sure that we're being really inclusive when we're doing that. And like you said, use language that really applies to attract who you want to have in your school.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the best strategy for that is to ask for help. Ask for help. There may be, there may be a power imbalance where I'm like, oh, I got to ask for help from somebody who's on the front line. Yes. You need the representation. You need the lens. Ask for help.
Yeah.
And moving on to the policies or practices, we did mention that one of them was the zero tolerance policy. That is something that makes it more conducive to punish rather than to heal. What we can do to create these healing classrooms is to look at our policies, look at our practices and our desk manuals. What are something that we just naturally fall into, which could be making it easier to blame and punish versus to partner and help restore. All right. So here are some suggestions that we have here to ensure success for the upcoming school year. First, I want to kick off with saying keep them in school. Give them options and support them, whether it's a traditional path or a non-traditional one, that supports them. There should be no service discrepancies or disparities for students who choose either one of those paths. Next, provide educators with the time and training that they need. Trauma-informed training, ample preparation. We talked about connection and relationship building, support and all of those support for incidences that will happen during the school year.
Yeah, and when we talk about trauma-informed schools, that means ensuring that all school employees, so that's your administrators, your teachers, your support staff, your school nurse, your school resource officer, librarians, custodians, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, like literally everybody understands the impacts of trauma and that they respond to behaviors and harm and safety concerns in a consistent way that is through empathy and accountability to restore balance. Trauma-informed practices, remember, is a mindset. It's understanding where students are at and how they're presenting to you. We want to increase the percentage of staff and educators of color. We've talked about that in all buildings and in all roles, because representation and experience absolutely matters. Mindful funding. It's $1 billion loss each year, and the economy gets the run of it. So pay teachers better, pay support staff better. And if you give them better, they're going to produce better for sure. We also want to increase resources for social and emotional support. So remember, trauma-informed care is shifting the mindset from what's wrong with you, what's wrong with this student, to what happened to this student and how can we better respond to them to support them and help them to grow and thrive.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I do want to say that in some schools, right, we talked about resources. Some schools are begging for more social and emotional support resources, which often comes from the role of a social worker or a clinical social worker or counselor. While some schools are begging for it, there are still other schools who are pushing them out. And this is because the profession of social work, of clinical social work or counseling sets the standards, professional standards to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is something that is embedded into the profession. So you may see that social workers and clinicians, counselors are being limited by districts and federal budgets and government funding. So if you see a campaign or anything that is supporting social workers in that specialty or related profession, please support them. Please reach out, understand that, we need them in our schools. We absolutely need them. But yet, because they have such a standard to accept and serve all, diversity, equity, and inclusion is for all, not just one group over another group. And they are the professions that will help us get to it. Our next suggestion would be to strongly make efforts to adjust workloads.
Oh my goodness, yes, because we want to prevent burnout, and we want to make sure that we have a safe space for students and all school staff. So like we said earlier, so teachers can teach and students can learn. We want to really place them in a place for success, socially, emotionally, and academically.
Absolutely. I know in my experience, I've had the privilege to experience a year-round track out system, which gives several breaks throughout the school year without losing any of the material that you're retaining throughout the school year and having to repeat lessons or go back in a curriculum after a long break. This also seems to help out with classroom sizes, staff burnout, and wages, because you don't have to be off and not being paid for 3 months out of the year. So that could be something that you look into for your school district or your school system.
And also that can help keep some kids safer. Sometimes they're safer at school than they are at home, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes that is when you're with your own kids so long, so much. It does, without that breakup of time. Not saying that schools and we want them to, babysit or anything, but why wouldn't school be a better place for them to be?
Right.
So next I want to say invest in a healthy work culture. Many of the issues that we see stem from our practices, our policies, our mentalities that are coming from the root of an unhealthy work norms.
Yeah, and I think now, we really have schools in crisis across the country, and morale is low, there's burnout, all of this. So we want to really foster a culture and a climate that's physically, emotionally, and relationally safe for everybody, students, staff, teachers, administrators, families, everybody.
Yes. Thank you, Laura. And if you would like help with that and figuring out where to start with the journey of creating that culture and climate, Sky Infinity is always willing to help. Visit our website to schedule a discovery or reach out to us through the email or Amber and myself, and we can get that started and we can help you figure out what that looks like for your organization. Last but not least, most importantly, I would say stay in the village. If your passion is education and you're part of the school, guess what? Then you're part of the community. And that's not always in the job description.
Right. And collaborating with outside agencies, which we mentioned before, and addressing the basic needs to partner, to help and not to blame. Also recognizing we are mandated reporters, right? But sometimes checking in with a school counselor or the nurse, or if you have a really good, safe relationship with a parent or caregiver, even with them first, if there's an issue that you're questioning might need to be reported. Sometimes there's a very logical explanation, and then it ends up not being needed to be reported. And other times you have to be careful because there are some contentious relationships with parents too, and you want to make sure you're safe. So sometimes running it by another person in the school might be helpful before you make that report. But the bottom line is we all have to feel safe. So collaborating with outside agencies such as like the health department, Child Protective Services, to make sure that, you know, Child Protective Services also is sort of responding in a trauma-informed way. Again, not blaming, but how can we help this family? Physicians, dentists, food shelves, any agency that you feel like you could collaborate with is going to be helpful.
Absolutely.
And I do want to say, when we talk about like a call to action, and I'll let you read that quote too. I just want people to know that trauma-informed practices, they hurt nobody. So if you're, you know, doing this in your school, it's not going to be harmful for kids who haven't experienced trauma. That's not how it works. Because again, remember, we're not diagnosing, we're not treating, we're just changing our perspective and changing how we respond to students. So trauma-informed practices hurt no one, they help everyone, as it is about psychological, emotional, and physical safety. So it's about support, having a voice, being heard, respect. There's a sense of belonging, there's developing relationships, there's representation, there's trust, and there's transparency. It's also about recognizing the reasons that are behind the misbehaviors, quote unquote, that we talked about. So it's time to stop responding punitively and start responding with empathy and compassion.
Oh, yes. And we can just leave that there. You guys see the quote, systems do not build themselves, people do. Systems do not dismantle themselves, people do. So which kind do you want to create? One for all or one for some? And we want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, for those who would like some help with their journey and figuring out how to do the trauma-informed workplace climate, visit us at skyinfinity.com. We would be more than happy to help and assist you. And we're going to go through the chat and see if there's any questions.